Welcome to the first episode of the Pursuit podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about why you might want to get into tech in the first place. We're here today with...
Hi, I'm Nadeem Shabir. I'm a technical lead at Thales.
Cool. What do you all do at Thales?
Well, most of what we do at the moment is developing software for universities to help with teaching and learning and managing reading lists for students and digitized resources.
Very, very cool. We've also got with us in the studio...
Hi, my name is Florence. I'm a UX designer and I work at Information Risk Management. It's a cybersecurity software company.
Oh, fantastic. So we're here today, we're talking to sort of a tech lead and somebody in UX. So this is going to be a really, really exciting conversation. The thing that I'm most interested in hearing about is why you got into technology in the first place. So Nadeem, what brought you into tech?
It's a long story. I think I started when I was probably 13. I managed to get a job digitizing drawings. It's really funny, digitizing drawings for an architect. And that just kind of got me into working with computers. And back then you could either digitize using tablets or you'd have to effectively program AutoCAD. So that's what I learned to do at a very early age. I kind of fell in love with it. I think for the longest time, kind of growing up from then to about 18, all I wanted to do was become an architect. And then when I found out that the degree was about 8 years long, or it was like an eternity, I'd kind of, through my education, so at A-levels I did computing, at GCSEs I picked computing as an option. I thought, why don't I try to do something in computing because I really like it. And ended up doing a degree in artificial intelligence and computer science because I didn't want to just do computing, I wanted to do something that was more rounded. And the AI degree I did at Birmingham University, there were elements of theology, philosophy, psychology, as well as all the programming stuff the software engineers had to do. So it felt like a more well-rounded degree.
So people coming into work that you're doing from outside technology, people who do have backgrounds in philosophy or sociology or theology, there's the chance to use that in their day-to-day work in tech?
There is, but I think it's, in a practical sense, it depends on what it is you're working on. Because there's elements of all of that may apply or may not apply depending on the domain you're working in. But it certainly doesn't preclude, I don't think, anybody learning how to program or learning how to become a developer. If you start off really early, though, I think you have more of an advantage, obviously. The later you leave it, the harder it becomes. But the really cool thing now is there's so many different kind of support networks and tools. And access to that information now is far more accessible than it was 20-something years ago when I first got started. So I think, you can pick it up.
So on your side, we've got somebody who started out really, really early, sort of your early teenage years, knowing that you wanted to work in technology. Florence, what made you move into tech and when did you do it? How'd you get here?
Well, perhaps this is a slightly less prosaic. Ultimately, I got into tech because I needed a job that paid me enough money that I could save up and do a master's and go off and get back into academia. I studied physics at university, and unfortunately I didn't do well enough to be able to get the scholarship to go straight into doing a master's and all that stuff. So I thought, well, what are the skills that I have that I can actually make a decent living fairly quickly? And as part of my course, because I studied theoretical physics, so a lot of what we do focuses as much on actually almost creating the experiments that in reality would either cost too much or be frankly impossible. So you're taught how to do a lot of programming, or at least there are the opportunities to learn a lot of programming. And so I learned a lot of C++, so a lot of object-oriented sort of software development. I mean, that's really what it is. It's not how they described it, but essentially you are learning how to create quite complex bits of software. And I really enjoyed that, and I found I was quite good at it. So I thought, okay, we'll take this further. And so I kind of got caught up in one of these graduate schemes that you get.
For listeners who might not be familiar with those, what do you mean by graduate schemes?
So you'll have big companies like Deloitte or IBM or other tech companies, and they often have placement opportunities for training. So for graduates who might come from a tech degree or from any other degree, each company obviously has their own sort of criteria. And then an opportunity to sort of get some initial training in the field. So it could be, in my case, The training that I went for was as a Java developer, but I've obviously different programs or specialize in different areas. And then you get the opportunity to work either at that company, or if it's more of a consultancy, then they might place you in another big company. So in my case, after the initial training, I was placed, funnily enough, actually, as an app developer at National Grid. As things turned out, they kind of realized they didn't really need us to be app developers. So we all had to those of us who were placed there, had to sort of find different areas to get involved in. And I had, by sheer coincidence, got really involved in the UX side of it. And as someone who's really, really passionate, I mean, when I was at uni, my passion was trying to make academia more open and get into citizen science. So anything that I can relate to making more open is my thing. And that's why I found UX really fascinating.
So just very quickly, for folks who may not have heard of UX, what is UX?
UX is short for user experience. It's a bit of a weird one because experience doesn't actually begin with X. And I know that's really silly, but that's something that still really annoys me. Should be called UE. But anyway, user experience is a field which is all about, well, from my perspective, it's very much about putting the user at the center of developing any technology. So as a user experience designer, my role is very much going out to meet the users, understand the context in which they will use any technology, and from that research, be able to create, well, essentially design the technology. So that can be from what's called information architecture, so thinking about how the product or the service is compartmentalized or organized, to designing interfaces. I mean, it's an interesting field because it's so broad. In some cases, so for example, some of the projects I was working on at National Grid, I often found the UX designers could be working really closely with solution architects. There could be a point where you almost wouldn't be able to tell the difference because you're both concerned about if this is the information that the user needs, how should this product be set up? So you could actually get very, very, very technical and get really deep into sort of how an app was kind of set up, middleware and backend and all that kind of stuff, to just designing or more focusing on how it would look and the components a user would actually interact with.
So you're working with user experience. So you're really working to take existing technology or emerging technology and have it shape the actual needs of users. But Nadeem, you're tech lead, you said. That sounds nice and mysterious and important. What do you do as a tech lead?
Well, a Thales tech lead is fairly nebulous. It generally just means we have more responsibility than some of the other developers, but only in a kind of a very small sense, I guess. The role itself, so most of the work I do is development work, and we do work with user experience. So we have a user experience expert in our team, and his focus is around exactly what Florence said, kind of fighting for the user and ensuring that the user is at the center of all of the interactions. And then developers are kind of charged with realizing that, to taking those designs and turning them into functioning pieces of software, with all the testing and all the scaling and all the performance issues you have to resolve with those when you're particularly at a company like Thales, where your software is being interacted with by millions of users, literally, at universities all over the UK and various other places now.
Cool. So yeah, it sounds like between the two of you, we've got some very, very different reasons to get into tech. Nadeem, the love of the work and the technology, and Florence, I'm going to high five you really, because both you and I were just like, wow, it'd be nice to get paid.
It's nice to get paid as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the practical reasons for getting into technology are something that's really, really attractive. So within your own networks and people you've chatted to, what kinds of reasons have you heard?
Getting paid is a very important reason, I think, for a lot of people. But I think there's also this thing that's kind of been happening over the last few decades here, particularly as we've, in the UK, transitioned from, well, whatever we were before, because it's been a while since we were a manufacturing economy, into more of a knowledge economy. And I think more and more people are seeing technology as a kind of path to careers that seem to be more sustainable than some of that. I'm hesitant to say all that old stuff, but because it's not really that old. And it's also far more accessible than I think a lot of other mediums are, I guess. So all you really need, and I don't want to do anybody a disservice, but as long as you have a computer, you can pretty much start on your own. You now have, people who started from nowhere and developed mobile phone apps that made them loads and loads of money. It feels, I think, to a lot of people that it's something that they can get started with. And as long as they're self-motivated, they can do something with.
I think that's really interesting as well, because you came up through a computer science degree and you came up through a graduate training program that sounded really interesting. And I'm completely self-taught. And I'm not necessarily the best example of a self-taught technologist, being lazy and deeply flawed. But I think that's a really important point. So you've got, I think everybody at the table here today has gone to university. But do you think this is necessarily something you need to go to university to be, like UX? Do you meet people in the UX space who haven't gotten a degree?
Yeah. And I have to be honest, one of the things I'm slightly concerned about, even though I am fairly junior in the field, is that as UX becomes more established, there does seem to be more of a push for people to get some kind of degree or something that's specifically either, say, HCI, so human computer interaction, or in an explicitly UX style course. And although I understand that on the one hand, because the field wants to be taken more seriously, and one of the easiest ways of doing that is say, look, these are the basic, these are the standards, this is the core stuff that everyone who calls themselves a UX designer should know. I think it actually takes something away from the beauty of UX, which is that it's a way of thinking about things, and it shouldn't be seen as something that is like the preserve of a particular industry or particular role. As a UX designer, I see myself more as a facilitator, actually, simply because of the fact that developers and solution architects and anyone else, they're all very busy and they all have enough to do. So you just need someone to always be saying, oh, think about the user, think about this. You're not there because nobody else could do it or because this is something completely unique or original. It's just to help out because everyone else is really busy. And so kind of extrapolating from that, going think about tech more broadly, I would say I don't think that, say, a university degree is necessary per se. And actually, as someone who didn't have the greatest experience at university, even the things that people often say, say you'll get the network or you'll get to meet people or you get that discipline, I'm not entirely sure that you necessarily gain. I think that's actually quite dependent on personality, not just about the university experience. So, yeah, overall, I'd agree. I'd say you don't really need a university degree. But what you do need, though, is realism. Because you have to understand that as much as someone like me is on this podcast saying you shouldn't really need a university degree, the fact is you will be up against lots of people with university degrees. And we live in an age where people like to see that kind of evidence. So find, maybe not university, but find some way of getting something that you can say, okay, this is definitely the thing that I have accomplished to show that I can do this. But that could be a project, that could be banging on like IBM's door asking them to let you in for a bit.
My dad got a job like that. He just Homer Simpsoned his way into it. He just showed up at a new IBM office the day they opened. I'll warn listeners that your own mileage may vary on that. Yeah. So yeah, I think this is a really, really interesting point. So you were talking about how skill-wise, it's not necessarily needed. You don't necessarily have to have a university degree, but it's often something that employers look for sort of either social proof or sort of a way to see if you're the same kind of people they are.
Well, there's certainly an element of a social contract there, because, I mean, that's what kind of underpins our economy and has done for, I guess, a very long time. So, yeah, I did a semi-traditional kind of route through university, and that kind of gives you a grounding. But these days, you're seeing more and more people who haven't gone through that route, learning how to become programmers, being self-taught. And there's some great examples out there of how I think the industry is starting to change in terms of what we perceive as value. So the degree does have a certain amount of value. But when I, for example, interview somebody to come and work with us at Alice, it's on the CV, but it's not the thing that I look for. The thing that we look for is what kind of experience do you have? Do you have GitHub repos where we can go and have a look at your code, the kind of code that you've been writing? Because that is a far more concrete example of your abilities or your experience than perhaps something, in my case, I did my degree, almost 20 years ago?
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, I kind of assumed you were a bit younger than me.
Almost 40 now.
Oh. You mentioned GitHub, and for listeners who aren't familiar with it, GitHub's it's sort of a little bit of a library. I always talk about it as sort of Pinterest for code, where you can show off bits of code you've written, you can contribute to people's projects, you can share projects. For those of you who are listening who haven't checked it out yet, going to github.com, and we'll include this in the episode notes, can give you a great idea of what your heroes are building or what your enemies are building and what you can start to do to build out a profile that you can offer proof to employers that you can do the thing.
I mean, so I think that's certainly one thing. There are other things that have started to emerge over the last 4 or 5 years. For example, the Open Badges Initiative. We pioneered some of the work around that at Peer-to-Peer University, which is a kind of a different organisation that I volunteer with. And the idea around that was, what would a university look like if you didn't have any infrastructure? And it was of the web, so no classes, no lecturers. Could people kind of, in a digital space, come together and teach each other skills, and then through a accreditation or a validation process, demonstrate what skills they'd earned? So we kind of pioneered that, and Mozilla took that on and made it far more formal, and through the School of Webcraft. And there were some real tangible things that came out of that. And one of the things I think it's really important to, one lens to look at this through, rather, is that our experiences here in the UK and in places like the US, where we're A, developed nations, and B, we have very well established higher education institutes, are, what we perceive as a standard path through education looks very, very different here than it does in somewhere like Brazil. And the reason I'm mentioning this as an example is, at the School of Webcraft, we designed a load of material that would allow, in principle, anyone to come and learn how to do HTML. And you'd work through the material, and in order to earn your badge, you had to do the exercises, and people had to peer review that. And if they thought that you did the right work, you would earn the badge, and that becomes almost like a digital CV. It's kind of almost a vanity project, I guess, if you're here in the West. But a bunch of kids in Brazil took that material because it was openly licensed, Creative Commons licensed, I should say, translated it to Portuguese, first of all, and then went through the materials themselves, built up their portfolios, and then were able, because they weren't able to financially afford to go to universities in Brazil, they were able to take those digital portfolios that they'd created and share those with employers in Brazil and actually get jobs, which I remember when we first heard of what had happened, we were all like, wow, this is amazing. And then there was that, the euphoria suddenly kind of stopped when you suddenly reflect on, that's a great story for there, but actually it has very little impact here in the UK or over in the US, because people view university degrees as being, the way to prove that you have a grounding in a particular field. The romanticist in me hopes that changes soon. The pragmatist in me thinks it's probably going to be like that for a while.
I mean, I hope it does change soon, because actually one of the things, and maybe this is getting a bit more social justice-y, but I often think that in the West and other developed nations, I think we almost take for granted our status as developed nations.
That's right.
I lived in Manchester up until maybe 3 or so years ago. I lived there for several years after I graduated. I loved the city. And there were areas of real poverty and real lack of access, actually, to education. Fine, they might be going to school, but if, say, their parents had recently arrived in the UK and there was language barriers, for example, institutionalised prejudice often means that kids aren't getting the support that they need. And even less commonly talked about cases, which is often just communities. I mean, we talk a lot, I think, maybe because of the more recent votes and all that kind of thing, we're talking a lot more about, say, the indigenous white working class. And actually, that was one thing that I found really interesting. You have whole areas of Manchester where the indigenous white working class kids actually were equally held back at school because of, say, institutionalized issues like classism, etc., etc. And so actually, I think things like open badges, I think they can have real impact here as well. I wonder if that's a case where we might just have to be a bit more honest about the issues that we're also facing in so-called developed nations, that we do actually have areas that are on par, actually. I mean, my family are from Nigeria, and I often see, or some of the things I saw in Manchester really kind of reminded me a lot of areas. And, you have people, say, with iPhones, but their houses might be a complete tip or whatever, you know what I mean? So
I think this is really interesting as well, because when we're talking to audiences of folks learning to get into technology, it's really, really tempting to say, hey, come on, everybody can do it. There's no barrier. But on some level, being really honest and saying, do you know what? It's not a true meritocracy. We're not in a system where you're going to get that first job by being better than anyone. It's a system where there are still biases in play, and some of them are coming in as an adult learner or coming in as self-taught or coming in without a degree means that getting into that first role becomes sort of a race to prove yourself a lot of times.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that is true is people often look for experience. How much experience have you got before we hire you as a programmer or as a developer? And one of the hardest things to get when you're starting out is that experience. And sometimes through things like graduate training schemes, that's a way to at least, so-and-so has been through this bit of formal education, but we're going to take them into the real workplace and generally tell them to forget whatever they've just learned and now learn to do it our way. That's the reality.
Yeah.
And yeah, there is still a challenge there. It's always really difficult because if you are recruiting and if you're looking for people, there's that balance between how much experience do you think they have versus how much potential can they demonstrate. And sometimes it's not obvious, but sometimes you can sense that somebody's really passionate. And actually, what you're taking a bet on is that passion and their interests and their values, if you think they're culturally aligned with your organisation or your team, is enough for you to say, I can sit there and maybe teach somebody to be a better programmer, but I can't teach them to care about what they're doing. And that's, I think, fairly key.
So yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting setup as well. So I think that with the demand we have for more tech talent, so anybody listening to this, don't let honest talk about it being challenging and there being barriers in the way discourage you. There is a massive, massive shortage of people to do these jobs. And I wonder whether or not if adding all of these extra steps, because once you get to be sort of middleweight, more senior in technology, a lot of these rules don't apply anymore. You don't have to go into the office. You don't have to wear a suit. You can work remotely. I work with somebody who's on the beach well, probably not right now, it's working hours. But I work with somebody who works remotely from the beach. And it's really difficult because I think we're presenting the end goal. Say, hey, work in technology, the pay's great, it's a lot of flexibility, you can do what you want, without recognizing that, hey, come work in technology, getting yourself into that first job is going to be really, really hard. Hey, come work in technology, the first couple years of pay, especially being self-taught, they're not going to be great. So really balancing the eventual rewards with what we're telling people the beginner experience is going to feel like.
It's as important to go and find that first job. And that first job should be something that you kind of believe in. And sometimes the way to do that isn't necessarily through looking at job listings. It might be. Camille's a great example. Camille, she did an undergraduate degree in mathematics. When she approached Alice, she applied for one of our internships. And some organisations don't pay interns. We do pay interns.
This is a great time to say to anybody listening that you should never, ever, ever take an unpaid internship under any circumstances, really. Even if you could afford to, please don't.
Yeah. So she came to us and she had very, very little experience doing any kind of programming. But what she did have was she was very smart. And I didn't think at the time that there was anything that would stop her learning. We offered her the internship. Now she's a full-time member of our team, an incredibly valued member of our team as well, because she's bloody good. But her route to learning how to become a developer was very much, she kind of taught herself with a lot of support from the people around her. And now she's a fantastic developer, but that was not necessarily the same route that most people thinking they're going to get a job as a developer might go to. It's very different, I think, in the States, because internships, I think, are more accepted. But the idea of going and working somewhere for 3 months or 6 months to learn the ropes and to learn a particular technology or a set of technologies and then move to somewhere else, it still hasn't taken on, I think, over here as much as I think it probably could. I think London's slightly different, but here we're out in the sticks. And well, we're not out in the sticks. Birmingham is a great place to come and work.
Birmingham is the finest city in the UK.
But
After Manchester.
And we don't have any commercials for this podcast, but we're going to take a break where I violently shake Florence until she sees the light. I'm a massive Brumophile. I'm of the mind that this is the finest city in Europe. So that's really interesting. So for me personally, I also went through a really non-traditional route into tech, which was I was a teacher for a long time. So taught in Asia, taught in the US, and then just got kind of a crappy marketing job at a crappy startup. And for any of you who may at one time work at a crappy startup, they don't always pay you on time, which in hindsight is a massive red flag. But I noticed that the programmers always got paid on time, and they got paid considerably more than I did. And they didn't seem that much smarter than me. They were sweet. So started doing some work in that. And really it was just a string of, oh, I want that. Can I do professional things to get that? So I really wanted to go to a conference but couldn't afford the tickets. And somebody said, oh, if you submit a talk and you speak there, you get to go for free. I was like, yeah. And did that a couple more times. And then I realized if you ask them, they'll usually pay your travel and hotel. And based here in the UK, it's real easy to get over to Germany and all sorts of wonderful European cities. So started doing that. And then started seeing the same people again and again. And they told me they worked in developer relations, which was a job that just let you build cool things and talk to users and fly around the world and speak at conferences. And I think that was my yes, please moment where I was like, yeah, I can't think of a polite way to say con my way into that. Convince the market of my value. I was thinking we could chat for a little bit about sort of reasons that people give to get into technology. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is there an invalid, is there a bad reason to get into tech? So a lot of people I hear say like, oh, you know what, you really need to go into technology if you've got passion for it. This has to be the thing you love, the thing you care about. But anybody who's ever done any Java development knows that like...
I've done Java development. It wasn't that bad.
Are you still real passionate about a project like 3 weeks into bug fixes?
It depends on what the project is.
For those of you who can't see into the studio, he's lying.
I'm not. So I think there's a couple of ways you can look at this. One is I think most people, particularly regardless of whether you go through the graduate program or not, when you're trying to find that first job or any job, it's finding the employment that's probably your... And some of us have the luxury of being able to say, you know what, I'm going to take time and find something that really fits. There's been this long-standing debate over whether you have to be completely passionate or is it just a job. I've done both, and I can tell you with my hand on my heart that I would rather do something I'm incredibly passionate about, because you've got one chance at life. You don't want to waste, to my mind, you don't want to sit there in front of a desk wasting, 9 to 5 or whatever hours you work. I mean, I work bizarre hours, but that's a personal choice for a significant period of your life that you're never going to get back doing something that makes you miserable. And there are roles within development that I think are very much like that. And I think a lot of people are attracted to, certainly when I was at university, you'd have all these big companies like IBM and people come around and try and convince you should sign up for our graduate developer program schemes. And you see all this jazzy literature and, wow, I want to go and work for IBM. And then you start to understand the practicalities around that. So when I was at Rolls, for a lot of developers, development actually meant somebody else did all the work around thinking and designing what the system was in a tool like Rational Rows back then. And what the developer actually got was a method stub that said, these are the inputs, and this is what the output needs to be. You just need to fill in the code in the middle. So you never holistically understood what the system you were building was. All you ever saw was a tiny piece that you had to fill in. That was your assignment for this hour, and then once you've completed that, you pick up the next one. And some people have described that as not necessarily paint by numbers, but it's very difficult to get a feel for your trade or for your tools. If you think of this as a vocation, or if you think of this as a true engineering discipline, you need to understand and appreciate so much more of it. And that was soul destroying. I've been in that world and I don't ever want to do that again. But sometimes you have to go through that to understand what it is you don't want. Some people are very, very fortunate. They kind of land on their feet at the beginning. Other people go through that journey and then make the decision that they want to do something more with their lives. I don't want to build systems for the government, designing weapons and stuff anymore. I want to get involved in teaching and learning. That might be your particular journey. But you have to be true to yourself. And I think that doesn't matter whether you're a computer scientist or a lawyer.
So I'm going to argue with you a little bit now, because I am an old lady and I have worked a whole bunch of jobs, and I have worked miserable jobs in the service industry, and I've worked miserable jobs in technology. And I was so much happier working miserable technology jobs where the pay was just above average. Like, yeah, getting paid enough to pay your bills and being unhappy at the same time. It's not great, but wow, I hated waitressing. Yeah. And with the shortage in the economy, like just the ability to be a little bit sassy with somebody who's like, hey, do this now. Every now and again, you could just be like, no, that's not going to happen. So yeah, just the extra sort of economic and structural power that I got out of technology, even being in jobs that didn't make me happy, were relatively great. I lucked out where my job is an absolute dream job, so I always try and remember this is sort of a freak thing. I'm incredibly lucky. Don't blow it and don't fail to be grateful. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting talking about bad reasons or more negative reasons for getting into tech. One of my main impetuses was the fact that I would be getting a decent wage. And in fact, actually, generally speaking, I'm the kind of person who would say, oh, you should never get into anything just for the money. But actually, this conversation and sort of listening to what we've all been saying, including myself, actually made me realize that it's as much about the underlying value, as you were saying, because it's like, yeah, fine, I wanted to be able to get paid, but then I also actually, there's something more fundamental beneath that, and that is making things more accessible, more open, whether that was theoretical physics or whether that's technology. So actually, I suppose if there is a negative reason, I suppose it would be something much deeper. So maybe wanting to just plain dominate or rule, you know what I mean? Like, it's not a bad thing just to get in because you want to make money, but think about almost like your underlying attitudes towards people. Because one of the things, like, I've been to a couple of really interesting tech conferences that were much more from the business and marketing perspective than solely the tech. And I always found it really interesting when you get entrepreneurs talking about, you know, money being like the bottom line. And although superficially you would think, oh, that's probably why there's so many issues, actually, for someone like me who's a UX designer, I'd say, well, actually, you'd probably be able to make double the profits even, I would put that out there now, by making more ethical tech, if you really thought about it. But the issue is that your underlying value system beneath the desire to make profit actually is what's wrong. So I would say that that's maybe some of the things that I've heard that are more negative. But that's not often what people say. Nobody actually says, oh, I just want to dominate. they'll couch it in other ways.
It's like, oh, I want to make the big new thing. I want to make this. Oh, and it's always I don't want to generalize. But yeah, once you start getting into tech spaces, as I hope listeners do, and getting to conferences and getting to meetups, pretty early on, you'll meet people who are like, hey, come join my big new idea. I'm going to make $1 million and it's always folks who want you to work for free.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we could have less of them in tech, that would be fine.
Yeah. So yeah, I'd agree. And I do think though in general, it is an interesting debate, and it's something that, it's really fascinating because I'm I try to be as practical as possible, and the balance between a passion project and something that kind of just gets you paid is something I've become much more acutely aware of as I've grown older. Although for all that I try to be practical, I do agree though that always try to find something that does speak to your innermost nature, because like I'm currently in a job where I'm getting up at silly o'clock, I'm going home at silly o'clock, and it is quite intense, it's quite stressful. But the thing that makes me want to keep doing that is the fact that I actually really enjoy it. I enjoy not just my role as a UX designer, I also enjoy the company I'm working at. I really love the people I work with. Like, I know the Christmas party's coming up, and I'm totally going to be that really embarrassing drunk who basically goes around saying, oh, I love you, I love you, I love you to everyone, because in a way it's kind of true. So I think finding that thing that speaks to your innermost person is something that's very important. Yes, and be aware of the fact that, that probably means you might not get the amazing pay straight off, but we will kind of have to make choices. Fundamentally, that's it, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think that we've had a really interesting chat, and we've had a couple different viewpoints. Like, hey, you know what I got into? You, Nadeem, you got into technology because it sang to you in your youth. And Florence, you got into technology because it would give you the flexibility to facilitate the things you really cared about that sort of were bigger than tech. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think that's pretty good for today. Thank you both so much for being here. And thank you all for listening. You've been listening to the Pursuit Podcast.